On behalf of the LA and Orange County Audio Society, these seminars are coming to you with people that you may not have met before. A couple of them have been here in previous years and are famous people in their fields. That's the reason they're on the panel, obviously. The most famous person, of course, in the room is our moderator, Dr. David Robinson, and I will read you his bio in case you didn't read it yourself. He's a university professor who's edited something called Positive Feedback online. Have you kept track of that one? He's only done this for 23, 24 years now.
24, I think.
24 this time. He upgraded this speech. He does editing, writing, publishing in a number of fields, fine photography, you can see his camera here as well, information technology, and something called leadership training, which I need him to do. Thank you for coming.
Thanks.
You're on.
Appreciate that, Chip. I want to say that Chip has been a tremendous person to work for. For those of you who don't know Chip Moore, our producer, he's really an absolute delight to work with. He's very enthusiastic about this subject field, but he's made it really easy for us to put together what is actually a pretty complex set of presentations on DSD. We've been working over the past few years, if you've been sitting in on these presentations, to keep all of you very well up to date with what's happening with DSD, which is becoming extremely exciting right now. The things we've been talking about for the last two years are starting to really hit critical mass. And so I'm very delighted that we're going to be able to share some extremely interesting information with you, because if you had a chance to hear DSD, you know already why we're excited. Okay. I want to introduce our fine and distinguished, not extinguished, but distinguished panel here. I'm going to start at the far end with Jim. I'm going to let each one of our panelists take a couple of minutes and tell you about who they are, because we got some great folks here.
It's about the toughest assignment a guy could have. Who is you? Well, I've been recording music for almost 40 years, 38 years. And of course I began with the most primitive kind of tools imaginable, because in a way, you either had pro gear 38 years ago, or you had primitive and barbaric things and you made it work. I've been lucky enough to grow up in a family and have experiences with the world of jazz, so that I suppose it's not too much of an exaggeration for me to say that I've probably known and still do know the great majority of jazz musicians. And I've been lucky enough that many of them are my friends. So I've had unusual access to record people who, well, you'd never be able to record unless they were your friends. Sweet Edison, Sarah Vaughan, Ella Fitzgerald, Tommy Flanagan. You get the points, and yes. And I've taken advantage of that. And luckily, my first recording that I ever made with really good gear took place in Boston about 1984 or maybe 83. Tommy Flanagan, the great pianist, was staying at my house. I helped open a new jazz club in Boston, and he was the second musician to come in there. After the first night there, we go back to my house for him to have a snooze. We don't sleep much, at least I don't, and he didn't either in those days. And he said, Jesus, that was great. Why don't we record tomorrow night? Can you get some gear? Well, I knew people at MIT, and we got the gear and we recorded it. And to be honest with you, beginner's luck, I just nailed the recording. Kind of not even knowing exactly what I was doing, but I did nail it. And we listened to it the next day, and he's doing backflips, and he says, I'm going to tell everybody. He goes back to New York, tells everybody in New York, you got to have Jim record you, and the rest is history. I'll just stop right there, but I guess I'm trying to say it's probably better to be lucky than good.
Yeah, if you're not familiar with Jim Merod, he heads up BluPort Records, and so he got some great jazz recordings. He's also a scholar. Don't be so shy and retiring. He's a scholar of jazz and music, has published books on the subject, teaches as a university professor himself. So Jim is really more than he makes himself out to be. He's quite an erudite, really fine person to be involved in our beloved passion. So he's also a good brother, a man who writes for Positive Feedback.
Well, David and I have long phone calls on occasion, sometimes very late at night, pissing our wives off, I'm sure. But But those are our best conversations, and David has really been, in many ways, the inspiration for my movement toward DSD. There's much more to say, but David is an engine of enthusiasm and encouragement.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, Andreas, speaking of engines.
My name is Andreas Koch, and I have a more technical background, and was lucky enough to work on several projects right at the beginning. For instance, when CD was launched, I started my professional life with Studio Revox in Switzerland, and helped build the first centigrade converters, digital noise reduction. And, it was an exciting time because nothing has been developed and invented yet. So we ran, of course, against several walls there. Then I switched over to Dolby, and Dolby was mostly analog at the time, and I was the first digital engineer that Dolby hired. And that was at the time when this whole compression craze happened. And of course Dolby had to have its own compression scheme, and I was working on AC1, which then evolved into AC3 and built the first incarnation of that. On to Sony later, and Sony was talking about DSD, and I had no idea what it was at the time or how to use it even. But it evolved into then something that we called SACD, or Super Audio CD, and I helped both Sony and Philips launch it. And it was a very exciting time because, again, it's a new format. Nobody knew what it was. There were no technical papers, and it was fun enough for an engineer like myself to just dwell into something that is new and fresh. That was mid-90s, and we started building all the professional tools, workstations for DSD, converters and editors and mixing, and we had to basically equip the studio to author in DSD. After that, did a little bit of consulting, and then started forming Playback Designs, and that was the platform then where I could distill all the technology that I built up over the 30 years and build converters.
Right, I think most people are fairly familiar with Playback Designs as far as SACD and DSD playback goes. Thanks very much, Andreas. Cookie.
I'm going to use this mic off axis. Do you know what that means? Trying to look something up. I started a commercial recording facility in 1982, and the rest of it has been just trying to make myself happy while sitting behind the console during that time. So I started recording on tape, and then in the mid-'80s, the first digital audio workstation came out, and we ended up being a beta tester, and it happens to be the same company that Andreas was working for at that time. I don't think we actually met, but we shared a lot of common people like Gus Guinness and Jerry Kirby. Later on, I worked for Windham Hill in the late 80s. How many of you heard of Windham Hill?
Windham Hill, yeah. How
many of you have Winter Solstice 2? All right. Check the back of that one. Yeah, that's me. And then after that, went back to my studio and continued specializing in acoustic music, jazz, bluegrass, singer-songwriters, and speckled in with some of my buddies like Brain and Buckethead. So there was a variety of music and my really crazy electronica friends. But about the late 90s, I was contacted by Jerry Kirby again to come and join them in a company called Liquid Audio. I don't know if you remember Liquid Audio, but they were the first MP3, company. And because I was their engineer, I ended up being the first one to record a concert and have it delivered worldwide. We were doing the dog and pony shows all over the world, literally, for audiences about this size, recording live up to the internet, and before the audience left, we would we would be playing back. It had gone around the world and available everywhere. At that same time, DSD was just coming out, or the SACD actually, and ran into Gus Skinnis. So my path diverged with MP3 and also being involved with DSD and SACD, which was interesting because we never thought MP3 would end up doing what it did. And there was just a point around the early 2000s where I said, okay, I've had enough. I can't handle Pro Tools, if you know what that is. No more PCM for me. What am I going to do? Well, I think I'll start a record label. And it's no compromise. I'm going to do it the way I want to do it, the way I hear the musicians performing their best, which is in a small group, just sitting around when I hear them rehearsing at the studio. That's what I wanted to hear. No headphones, just live, all the dynamics. And Gus Skinnis came to those sessions with the Sonoma system and DSD. So we recorded to tape in DSD, and that became the Blue Coast Collection 1. In 2007, we released it to the Audiophile audience, which was completely new to me. I've been in pro audio for all these years, and I loved it. I mean, here was a group of people who appreciated acoustic music and what we were doing. June 2007, Gus said, well, why don't you just release your DSD files? Because everything we did was to DSD or to tape. And I said, but who's gonna buy it? Well, anybody with a Sony PS3 can play it. Okay, so we put it up, made it available, and we were shocked. People who didn't know how to play it, they had foobar, there were ways to do it. 6 months later, Andreas gave a call and said, guess what? Our device is going to play DSD. Now we have more than 100 manufacturers dedicated to DSD products, hardware and software, in 2 years. It's amazing. And I want to thank you all for being here.
Who's ever heard of Walter Mitty? That's me. I'm a ex-professional sales manager, ex-Boston Symphony Pops, lighting director, board operator, scenic designer, graphics designer, and a passionate interest in the recording business. My passion part started when I was in high school. Met a man who is ultimately a producer at CBS, a man by the name of George Schauer, who had an Ampex 300 that I lusted after, and wound up buying a Tape-Sonic tape machine, a couple of Altec lipstick microphones, and started doing recording in college. I finally found that I really didn't have a talent for this. It requires a music background. So I followed my father's advice and went into the corporate world and became ultimately a sales manager for companies like T.H.E, which flew in the test and measurement business, which is close to my engineering background. About halfway through that, I befriended a nice man by the name of, the Alzheimer's is catching up, Jerry. He owns Post-One Recordings in New York. Name will occur to me in a second. And he was the importer of T.H.E microphones at the time. I wound up buying an Ampex 102, ATR 102, and about 7 or 8 T.H.E microphones, and paddled around with he and a couple of other guys in New York City doing field recordings, which was great, except that it never got better. It was just as good as it got for stereo recordings that we were making. So I ultimately got frustrated, sold all of that stuff and bought an airplane. And that was a very interesting hobby for 20 years. While at the Boston Symphony, one day, the group that runs the engineering department at WGBH, we're doing a feed over the internet. This is now 10 years ago, 12 years ago, from MIT Media Lab to University of Southern California over a high-speed internet of a multi-channel project. And this was the Symphony Hall, but it was the Boston Philharmonic as opposed to the Symphony. And I was in the hall that day for whatever reason, and I asked Jim if I could just take a listen. He said, sure, because in my activities there, I've been watching recording guys in and out all the time. So I went down to what is now affectionately known as the DGG room, and sat down, and there was only a solo harpist on the stage tuning. And I listened to that for about 20 seconds and said, right. Sold the airplane and wound up buying components to build a multi-channel system. I feel that that my interest in capturing the real event is more accurately realized with that. Being the Walter Mitty type, I formed an association with John Newton, who owns Sound Mirror. And the way I got to know John was I cut a snake. He had a 32-channel snake from the attic of Boston Symphony Hall down to the GGU room. And during the process of putting a lighting system in, we cut it. So after that wonderful introduction, John kind of took pity on my interests and allowed me to start to accompany him on recording gigs. He has employees who do that, so it's kind of problematic in that if I'm taking a seat, one of his employees is not. So I would always be accompanying him when it was either he or just he and Blanton Oswald, who is the producer for most of John's stuff. So I got to do a number of recording jobs, and this is actually a good story. I wanted to join the Recording Academy because my grandkids would think that would be really hot stuff to be able to vote. So I told John, he says, well, you got enough credits, sign up. I said, okay. So I called the Recording Academy up. He said, well, the problem is you're not a recording engineer. You have to have that or higher to be in the engineering production wing, to be a member, a voting member. I said, okay. So I told John. And he said, well, we're going to do the Kansas City Chorale next January. You can be a recording engineer on that. You know how to run Paradex. So I said, sure. So I went there and did that gig. So it was 4 days. And at the end, this is kind of a family thing amongst these folks. They are the combination of the Kansas City Chorale and the Phoenix Park Choir, all under Charles Brophy, the conductor. We were up taking this gig, the equipment apart, and Charles starts asking Blanton, how'd the session go? What'd you think? And I'm pulling feet. And Blanton gives his normal critique of the recording session. He asked John, what did you think? John, being the professional he is, says A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And he turned to me and he said, Tom, what'd you think? I said, gee, I think this is Grammy material. And John and Blanton looked at me like, are you kidding? It won 2 Grammys. So not only am I now have letters after my name. Most people have Ph.D. or whatever the title would be. I have GCNE after my name. Mm-hmm. Great creds, no experience.
But it's quite something to have somebody who has actually gone through the process and won a couple of Grammys, and it's in some of the directions that we're talking about for the future. Tom works together very closely with Jared Sachs at Channel Classics. Those of you who have any of the Channel Classics SACDs or have downloaded the DSDs know that they have brilliant production values and wonderful recordings. As a matter of fact, in a few minutes we're going to be hearing from Jared, who sent another video greeting to all of his friends here at the show. If you get ready to see that. Okay, so what we want to do today for you, having given you a sense of who we are, is we want to spend a little bit of time talking about the theme that I came up for this session. We have 2 DSD sessions as we've had over the last couple of years. The one that we're going to have tomorrow deals with what DSD is. It's really for people who are rather new to the format or would like to refresh their understanding of DSD as a format. And we'll be talking about how to set it up in the home, how to make it run correctly on both Windows and Mac platforms, and give you an acquaintance with how to get the most out of it, okay? Today, however, is going to be a session, the session is entitled DSD From the Studio to Your Home. And the idea here, and it's a really important one for people who love audio, is this, and that is that DSD is giving us, for the first time in history, Andreas and I talked about this the other day, a direct link from the studio to what happens when you listen. All of the intermediate layers, all of the changes, the transformations, usually that lose something along the way. In the world of DSD downloads, essentially, you can download the master. You can download a master, you can have it on your computer, you can play it through plain old USB 2 that just about everybody on the planet has, on either a PC or a Mac, and you can play it back on dozens of DACs now. When we first started talking about this, there were a few. Now I'm having trouble keeping up with it, which is the best news I have for you is I, who have made a study of this, am having trouble keeping up with how many of the solutions that are priced from $799 retail up. You choose. It's affordable, it's doable, and what's most important, people like Cookie or people like Jim, for that matter, people like Joe and others who are working with this, Tom, Jared, and the like. Jared tells me, when you download my DSD master, you have the exact same file I use. It is the file I produce SACDs with, it is the master I recorded to, and it is yours forever. Just don't crash your hard drive. And this direct link from the studio, from what's going on in our studios, to you has never happened in audio's history before. Never. It's the most revolutionary thing as a historian of audio I can think of. It's the first true advance in audio in 50 or 60 years. So not even the optical intermediary. Andreas could talk all day long about the optical dimension of SACD and all of the things that go in there. Now that's been stripped out. We've completely decoupled DSD from the optical delivery format that was called SACD. Now we just have DSD. Now you get the pure thing. There it is. Okay, so we're going to spend some time bringing you up to speed on what's been happening at the level. Jim and Cookie and so forth are going to be talking about what's happening there. Tom's going to have some notes. We've got some people in the crowd here, people like Joe and others. Bruce is familiar with some of the things that are involved, who should feel free to jump in on this as well. We want to talk about the exciting things happening at the studio level, and that'll pump you up for tomorrow's session where you're simply saying, okay, so how do I do this in my house? Thank you very much. Okay? Okay. So Tom has got something here for us. This comes to us from Jared Sachs, who is the president and chief recording person over at Channel Classics.
Two things to show you. This is Jared's introduction, and then a real short slideshow of what I would call the anatomy of the recording section.
Incredible. Mile of Five, Eva Fischer, Budapest Festival, an incredible combination, and I'm very honored to have been working with them for the last 10 years. I'm Jared Sachs, Channel Classics, and thank you for giving me this small opportunity to speak with you at the Newport Home Audio Show and tell you a little bit about who I am, what I've been doing. I'm homegrown, actually, Bostonian. Went to Oberlin Conservatory, found my way to Europe playing as a horn player, and been living now in Holland for 37 years, making a hobby of listening to music. I even worked in radio stations in America, making that into my profession and having a record label for the last 22 years. My approach to having a record label is my direct involvement with musicians. Actually, if I can't do that, there's really no sense for me to even be doing this. I want to be part of that process from the beginning to end, getting to know the musician well, speaking about all aspects of the recording and, of course, the marketing. The CD for a musician is a marketing tool to promote them. It's their visiting card, if you could call it that. And I'm extremely proud that a lot of the recordings have helped the musicians and getting more world known, if you might call it that, through the recordings. And if they do well, of course, then the record label will do well. Being part of this process gives me also the opportunity to work with the best equipment available. I even call it my own personal challenge to try to do that. If people aren't interested in the quality, that's fine too, of course. We're there for the music. But when Philips asked me way back in 2000 to help them implement the DSD, I just jumped for it. It was a chance for me to take up my own challenge, as you say, and really try to see how far I could bring it. And indeed, the technology, in my own words, would say the technology is now no longer in the way of listening to the music. And that's extremely important. And for those like you who appreciate that, that's why we're all together in doing this. For 3 years now, I've been working with the Grimm AD converter, a Dutch-made piece of equipment. I've worked with all the AD converters up to now, from DCS, Meitner, Gen X, but I find the Grimm to be the most musical. Its imagery, its depth of sound, and is just phenomenal. And I'm extremely happy to be using this in combination with some really important improvements. As it is, all my equipment is handmade. My preamps for the microphone is all battery powered. I've been using from the Hill carbon cable. And the combination of these, I'm extremely happy with the clarity, the openness of sound, and if you have a chance to listen to some of these files, I think you'd agree with me. An important aspect of how I work is that at the recording station, which of course is an analog stage, I'm making my mix. I'm doing this to keep the integrity of the DSD signal. So this means the least amount of post-production work needed. When I have to go into post-production or through the mixer, this means indeed going to DXD, a kind of a high frequency PCM, but there is a difference. So whenever possible, I keep it in the DSD domain, and doing that quite a bit. So I think that really makes a big difference. Tom Caulfield is with you, and he'll explain some things further, or certainly answer any questions you might have. Again, thank you for your time, and hope you have a chance to listen to some of our files on our website from Channel Classics. Thank you.
It's a brief presentation about what a field report is like, what the elements of the field report. This is specific to Channel Classics, but is indicative of all field recordings. The reason you do a field recording is to take advantage of the natural acoustic of the hall. So to that extent, they come in large size. This is the Merod Hall, Concert Hall in Budapest, Hungary.
Tom, is your microphone on?
Hello, hello.
Okay.
Get an idea of the scale of the place. A medium-sized hall in Leiden, in the Netherlands, all the way down to a small little tucked-away church. Notice that all of these places have wooden floors, which is an ingredient that gives the sound and richness. The technical art of any recording session is the microphone choice and placement. And what you see here are the 4 microphones that make up the Philips originated stereo pair, where there's 2 widely spaced, about 8 feet, omnidirectional microphones and 2 closely spaced, like ORTF, omnidirectional, and they're mixed together to create a broad sound field. You can also see the back end of the MS microphone just underneath that array. You get a better idea in a side view of it. The 4 microphones in line that make up the stereo pair, the MS array that is blended into that stereo pair, and you can see an assortment of different spot mics which are throughout the orchestra. This particular session, which is 3 weeks ago, would use 24 microphones. But the 5 that make the principal sound are the stereo pairs, the center MS array, and the 2, which you just see the corner of one at the top, ambience microphones, rear ambience microphones. This same scheme, here's just a larger view of the same thing. You can see the 2 ambience microphones at the left high and right. The same scheme is used regardless of the size of the hall. This is, again, a medium-sized hall in light. You can see the inline, the 4 omnidirectional microphones with a stereo pair, the single MS pair in front of it, and 1 of the 2 ambience microphones. And scaled down to a smaller performance, a solo performance hall. In this case, the center 2 omnidirectional microphones are replaced with the MS pair. Common to all of these sessions is the equipment necessary to do it. This is the recording equipment to do the mix, the analog mix. All of Jared's recordings are recorded in DSD. You can see it's just a lot of it. And that stereo pair, along with the 3 other multi-channel microphones, all go through that top converter, the Grammy D1. The additional converters are to track all of the remaining microphones for protection, basically. At least recording, documentation of the recording. The front end of this is a analog mixer. There's actually 3 different units there, but what's particular about it is the unit on the top is the microphone preamp for the most important microphones. And you'll notice that all the faders on the consoles are all at one position or the other. What Jared does is during the rehearsal, he establishes a balance for this particular music, for this particular alignment of the orchestra on the stage. He'll establish a balance, take off the attenuator indicators, what the attenuation is, and put that into the switched attenuators that are inside of the mic preamps. He then can take his console microphone, his console faders, and push them all the way up, get them out of the circuit. There's just an extraordinary amount of detail that's taken in trying to basically get out of the way of the music. And it's the music that it's all about. This happens to be a Brahms 4 recording, again, 2 weeks ago. But the interesting element of making music is the care and detail taken in it. There are fundamentally 2 ways to do a concert, to do a classical recording. One is go record the concert. The other is to rent the space, rent the orchestra, and record the concert, record the actual performance, but in a way that allows the musicians to investigate the music to a much greater degree than they're able to do in a concert performance. Typically, the recordings are done by movements, and they'll do 3 takes. At the end of each take, the conductor, in this case, Even Fisher, comes down, and he'll listen to it, and the producer, who's to his right or left, will confer with him and define what changes should be made. Primarily, it's the conductor listening to this as if for the first time saying, this is what I want. And he'll take notes, and in many instances, he'll bring the principal members of the orchestra down with him, and they'll define what has to be done to get even a higher level of performance. This, in any case, in any of these recessions, the actual performance has been done many times prior to that. In this particular one, they were on tour for 2.5 weeks. They must have done this bronze a dozen times. But they approached the session as if it was that same degree of detail goes on regardless of the size of the performance. This is the Amsterdam Sinfonetta, and this is Rachel Podger. But in each case, the amount of detail, the amount of what can we do to this particular bar to get the feeling of the music across comes through. For 40 minutes of music, it's typically 12 to 18 hours recording to achieve that. During any session, the producer is writing down his score, the takes that achieve what they were looking for, and that then brings to the next step, which is editing it. There are two principal ways to do a recording, a classic location recording. One of which is called tracking, where you take all the microphones, you run them full level, and you listen to them. You track it, you record them. You also run them either digitally or analog through some form of a mixer, so you can monitor the mix, but you don't record that mix. You simply monitor from it. The alternative for that is do a mix and a balance at the session. And the plus side of that is you get the closest to the analog signal that was available. The downside is that you have no chance to change that in post-production. So it's really a stylistic choice of how you want to record, how you want to capture this music. And Jared has reached this point after doing this for more than 20 years now, that this is how he prefers to do it. Analog mix. From that, actually, at the recording, at the editing session, which is usually done either with the producer and or the conductor or performer, the various takes are assembled into a thing called an edit master. The edit master then is both a stereo and a multi-channel edit master. By and large, for Jared's work, he'll take two stereo channels that may become the left and right primary channels for the multi-channel. Center channel is tracked independently of the left and right, in spite of the fact that it's also mixed into the left and right. And the two rear ambient channels are tracked independently. He'll take those, regardless of whether it's stereo or multi-channel, and create a file called a DST file, which is the authoring file that you send then to a pressing plant that then gets you an SACD. The result of that, of course, is a warehouse of discs. And these discs are the stock for the distributors and his stock that he sells online for his website. In addition to the sale of SACDs, Jared will take the actual original edit master and put it on his site for download. He has now available on all his newest editions, both the stereo and the multi-channel DSD. And through a Weiss Saracon, we'll subsample that down to 192, 96, 44.1 kilohertz PCM and an MP3 file for somebody who just wants to know what the music content is, not interested in the actual performance, the sound quality. That's basically his business.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. What you see here on that last frame was the interface that's over on the download site, because this has been the big development that we've seen coming for the last several years now, is that we were going to leave SACD behind. That was a, how to put this politely, that was a Sony Philips muck-up. They basically bungled the format as an optical format, but beyond that, there are much larger forces in society and in our musical culture that are pulling us beyond optical delivery and even physical media. Whether we could do this without compromising the quality was the question, and that was a question open until DSD became a download format. So what I want to do for a second here is I want to switch directions. Have Andreas, is there any comment you would make as far as where things are at the studio and DSD download level? What's happening from your standpoint as an engineer?
You know, we're, as you I think pointed out already, at a point where DSD is separated from its physical carrier, SACD. And it's not as famous as SACD yet, but you know, people get to know what DSD is and what the advantages are, and it's kind of like a new format, and it's just liquid. It's not bound to a physical format. So that's really an exciting time, and you know, people like Cookie, you know, pioneered the DSD download several years ago already, and you know, it's starting to get to a point where other studios are joining forces as well. You know, until maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it was kind of a chicken and egg thing, where you know the studio people said, you know, there's no hardware to play it on, and the hardware manufacturers said, well, there's nothing to play it with or into. And you know, on the hardware side, it was actually fairly easy about a year and a half ago to unite and come up with a very simple standard of how to upgrade all the D2A converters, or most of them, and allow them to receive native DSD. And that kind of started to open the floodgates also on the studio level. And you know, I think this year is really the breakthrough when even major audiophile labels join the bandwagon and say, you know, we're offering all our recordings in DSD for downloads. And there's going to be more exciting announcement this year. I already know, I was told that in Munich, that besides Channel Classics, also Polyhymnia is working on releasing their library for DSD downloads directly. And others I cannot talk about yet, but it's going to happen.
Yeah, we'll get to that as we get a little further in the presentation. Jim, you've been doing some work as a recordist now with DSD. And Jim is a person who is so deeply into the music, it's incredible. I'd really like to hear your impressions and some of your recent production comments about DSD.
I guess I have to go against the grain of everything that we've been saying here so far, insofar as we've been stressing the technical lucidity of the signal, which is fantastic. I mean, I'm not here to derogate it. I'm a champion of it. But the insistence upon the priority of the signal pristine quality overlooks something that I think DSD, Double DSD, and soon now Quad DSD allowed to be brought forward, which is the bloody excitement of the moment of the musical creation itself.
Hear, hear.
And what I want to emphasize here is that, for example, when Joe Cabala and I recently spent, what was it, 10, 11 days in Budapest, congruent with the opening of a new jazz club there called the Opus Jazz Club. Beautiful place, a little miniature like La Scala, great place. There's some problems with the acoustics, we noted, but also a concert hall in a separate place that's more nearly for classical music. We found ourselves in a number of recording ambiances. One was a rehearsal room with a big band. Another was a rehearsal room with a quartet. Then there was the club itself, which had the big band. And then there was just another variety of things. Finally, we went to Pannonia Studio, and we recorded an album in double DSD with the great Cornel Fiketi-Kovash's quartet. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that the DSD and double DSD allow, for exactly the reasons that we've mentioned here today, a preservation of the nuances of detail in the music, but the nuances of detail in the ambience, plus the nuances of detail in the feeling of the musicians, or the grease, I would call it, the emotion, the imagination. You could almost damn near say the spirit of what they bring. And I guess I want to emphasize that what excites me about double DSD, and soon quad DSD, the emerging technologies people are already bringing that forward, and if I'm lucky, I get to use quad DSD in September, is that we now have a deeper look into not just the music, but the moment of the performance and the feeling of being in the room. And why I'm emphasizing this is that because...
Preach it, Jim. Tell him.
Well, I'm going to try. I hope you're with me, Russ. The way in which music is marketed is so bloody widget-oriented, you never, almost ever believe that musicians sweat and groan and worry and there's an anxiety. And get this, accidents often direct where the music is going to go during a performance. And the DSD formats, plural, are allowing us to be closer to the real 3- and 4-dimensional quality of a music performance for me, and I think maybe for Cookie, no doubt for Andreas too. You, huh? That's what the music's all about, that ne plus ultra, that mysterious, enigmatic quality of being there when something that almost can't be recorded, now it can be recorded. It's kind of a 4-dimensional thing.
You can see why I asked Jim to be with us. I've asked my dear friend Joe to come up too, because Joe's actually been doing work with Jim. And Joe, I'd be interested. Joe, of course, is very well known as one of the principals in Kubala Sosna. Also a fellow photographer, so he's a really good guy. But I'd like to get your impressions of what it's like to work with DSD at this level, Joe.
I'd like to say what he said. For me, when I record something, or Jim and I approach a project and we do it in double DSD, there's just something fundamentally different about what you're